Good evening. I'm Carol Ghiorsi Hart, Director of the Greensboro History Museum, and on behalf of our nonprofit board and the City of Greensboro, I welcome you to our webinar. Today's program is part of the museum's Project Democracy 2020 initiative, exploring American democracy through exhibitions, public programming, and community connections. Project Democracy 2020 is made possible in part by funding from the North Carolina Humanities Council, a statewide nonprofit and affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Other major sponsors include the Tannenbaum Sternberger Foundation, Wells Fargo, the O. Henry Hotel, and Fox Rothschild LLP. As part of this initiative, the museum hosted the Smithsonian traveling exhibition, American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, between December and March of this year. That exhibition was developed by the National Museum of American History and adapted for travel by the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. We are currently developing our own exhibition, North Carolina Democracy. We're working on it, which we hope to open in the fall. Now, Great Leap of Faith was originally scheduled to end on March 29th, but due to the COVID-19 crisis, we had to close a few weeks early. So those of you who waited too long, next time you'll know. Don't wait till the end. You never know what's going to happen. We also had scheduled an in-person program with one of the curators of the exhibit, which had to be canceled. But we are delighted to have been able to reschedule this talk as this live webinar tonight, which will get you even more upfront and personal in the comfort of your own home. And if you're watching on the Zoom, right in the bottom where it says Q&A, please ask questions while you think of them as our speaker is talking. And then at the end of the talk, we should be able to get to some of them. Our speaker tonight is Barbara Clark-Smith, co-curator of American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith, and a curator of political history at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. She's a well-known historian of revolutionary America, and in her career at the Smithsonian has produced exhibitions on 18th century life, 17th century Jamestown, Quebec, and Santa Fe, and Thomas Jefferson's Bible. So without further ado, Barbara.
Thank you so much, and I'm so pleased to be there. I look forward to getting there physically, and I'm certainly going to come see your North Carolina Democracy exhibit when it opens. I'm pleased to be talking with everyone at this kind of extraordinary and difficult and meaningful time. I think it's a time of potential in our history, and in particular, it's an amazing time to engage with you on the topic of American democracy. So by American democracy, I mean first, the exhibition that opened at the National Museum in July of 2017. And second, the traveling version produced by Sites, now being hosted and in fact augmented and improved by leading history museums, who add artifacts from their own collections to the exhibition. So my talk is grounded in that exhibition and its artifacts and themes. But at the same time, American democracy is obviously also the political and social system most closely identified with the United States, and that those of us in the US have inherited, and about which we have many deep and conflicting ideas and feelings, many of them evident today. So this conversation, the talk and the conversation that engenders can't help but be about both the American democracy in the museum and the American democracy that we are living now. So this is the point where I need to say that the views I express here and now do not necessarily represent those of my institution as a whole. While my institution certainly would stand behind me as a good historian, I try to get my facts right, I'm recognized as doing good work. all history, all stories involve choices and matters of emphasis and interpretation. So it's really important for me to say, not everyone at the Smithsonian would necessarily agree with my interpretation. In fact, it's important to realize these exhibitions were collaborations. I was one of 4 curators. We each had our own specialty. I had the founding era. Other people worked on the sections on campaigns, sections on petitioning, and sections on the vote. And so we worked closely together and we interacted, and we certainly did come to agree on many basic principles and frameworks for the exhibition. But the truth is, you might think of this exhibition as a set of essays written by different scholars, in this case, curatorial scholars. And I have to say that even those other curators might not always agree. They might have a different view on some of the matters I'm going to talk about tonight. So it may help to imagine this as a collaborative piece, as I said, and I think our process of each bringing our expertise and working through differences and each having our own voice through the exhibition turned out to be just the right way to do it. Because the theme I want to highlight is precisely this, that America's system of government, our democratic republic, has required of its inhabitants a willingness to work with people with whom they disagree, whom they do not know, and oftentimes who they do not even like. You know, it's sort of an act of imagination. The scholar Benedict Anderson calls a nation an imagined community, meaning that you make this, this intellectual and emotional connection, which connects you with people of different regions, religions, interests, occupations, beliefs, ideas, backgrounds. And that's the way that people create nations. First, by imagining themselves in common community, and then acting on that felt connection, embracing common commitments, developing a sense of loyalty. So at different moments in history, we can see commitment to a nation in the United States waxing stronger or waning to the point of breaking. At every moment in the life of the US, there's been a question for people to answer. How far do they value participation in our national democratic political system? Do they value that more than they might value other values or identities they might hold? So let's dive in, or make a great leap. I contributed the title Great Leap of Faith to the section, to the overall exhibition, and to the first section of the exhibition. I contributed it because it evokes for me the seismic change that took place in the late 18th century. The fact that colonies should break away and become an independent nation now seems normal, nearly inevitable, as if just built into the logic of time. And similarly, it's tempting to assume that a system based on hereditary monarchy and hereditary aristocracy would give way to a system without these sources of authority, a system based fully on the principle of popular sovereignty. All this can seem, in retrospect, not only logical, but almost destined to happen. So that assumption about history is actually reflected in the artifacts available to me in building this exhibition. I found in our storerooms at the museum a distinct lack of attention to the history of royal government in America. There's plenty of interest in colonial artifacts, furniture, furnishings, textiles, but not so much when it came to government. It's as if our history began with the conflict with British authority in the 1760s. What was missing were the many years when Americans lived under colonial political institutions in some amity with and acceptance of British authority. So my first decision was to try to recover the monarchical past. And what you're looking at now are mezzotint engravings. That's King George III, on the left, and his queen, Charlotte, on the right. These were made by a British printmaker named Richard Houston in 1772. And they are after famous oil paintings done by John Joseph Zoffany in 1771. And those are now in the Royal Trust collection. So these images remind us, I think, of the presence and the power of monarchy. George here is age 33. He's not in full regalia. He's sitting rather than standing in a robe. Instead, he's wearing a general officer's coat with his hat and his sword on the table. So he's announcing his connection with the army, his role as protector of the people, but he's also being reasonably informal. And the companion piece with Charlotte emphasized that he was a family man. They suggest what British political historians tell us, that during the 1700s, during the reign of the three Georges in particular, there was a growing respect for the king among the people of the kingdom. If you measured it by popular celebrations such as royal coronations, royal birthdays, weddings, that sort of thing, there were many more of those sorts of things happening in the course of the 1700s than had happened before. There was not just respect, but increasingly affection, particularly for this third George. It was very evident, not just in England, but in Scotland and Wales, and indeed in North America itself. So these particular prints have provenance only in England, and they were probably, they would have been too expensive and too fine to be purchased by many people on the colonial North American market. But plainer and simpler and more affordable black and white representations were available in the colonies by the 1750s and 60s. And it represents the fact that many people in the colonies saw themselves as loyal subjects of George III. They toasted his health at taverns, they celebrated his birthday, they prayed for him in growing numbers of Anglican congregations, and they fought in his American wars. Besides embracing the monarchy, many of the colonists in British America also embraced the English idea that both social and political hierarchy were necessary to a stable government. To paraphrase one early governor of Massachusetts, some people were born high and mighty and meant to rule, others mean and lowly and meant to obey. In fact, a number of leading men in the colonies worried that their societies were not hierarchical enough. They compared themselves with England and Europe, and they thought, we don't have as much social hierarchy. Now, they're wrong in one critical way. They were not including in their thinking the 20% of the American colonial population who were enslaved, Africans and African Americans in 1776. So that's really important to bear in mind. But when they made these comparisons, they compared the European American population in the colonies with Europe, and they were upset that not that many great lords and aristocrats found it attractive to leave England and come to the colonies. They worried that there would be a great deal of social disorder and that the government would not be properly run. However, there was a class of families who, although they're technically commoners, not nobles, were distinguished by their wealth, their social standing, their education, and also political office. They tried to mark themselves off in their costume, how they traveled, if they could afford carriages, in their houses, and by fashionable and expensive possessions. This teapot made of silver and decorated with a coat of arms of the Robinson family is an example of the growth of a gentry or gentleman and lady class, families who took pride in their standing. This teapot was made in Rhode Island by a silversmith named Samuel Casey in 1752. And it was made for Abigail Robinson, who married John Wanton, the son of the colonial governor. And it testifies to the presence, first, of social aspiration, but second, this really deep idea that the people who should be running things are the ones who are better off and socially established. So all of that is to say that what happened in the course of the American Revolution in the 1760s and 70s, seen from the perspective of this powerful monarchy, was indeed something pretty remarkable, a great leap of faith. And to talk about that, I want to talk just quickly about Thomas Paine and his pamphlet, Common Sense. Paine, of course, was an English immigrant and one-time corset maker, one-time tax collector, and he published Common Sense in January of 1776. It was reprinted numerous times in that year alone and quickly sold an estimated 150,000 copies. Now, Paine, in this pamphlet, which was published anonymously, you won't see his name there on it, although it quickly became known who had written it. He argued for the colonies to declare independence and become a separate nation, but also for the absurdity and the corrupting nature of all hereditary power. He belittled the background of kings. He called William the Conqueror a French bastard, landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself King of England without the consent of the natives. So he ridiculed that. He ridiculed the very premises of hereditary power. And he pointed out that while the original lords might have been great men who rose to eminence through talents and service to the nation, all too often the offspring of these so-called lions of British society turned out to be another type of animal, an ass. So I must have read the pamphlet Common Sense 5 times before I realized what the title meant. In Paine's world, common sense as a term referred to the analytical capacities of a particular group of people, common people, as opposed to royal people or noble or aristocratic people. So I don't want to overstate the causal significance of this particular pamphlet. It's not that it caused the revolution. It came in at a moment when there was already many events, and the exhibition certainly looks at many of those events that engaged people high and low in the colonies. But I think it reflects this great moment of extraordinary change in the way people thought. They began to be able to think of themselves not as Britons, but as Americans. And equally important, they imagined their nation somewhat differently. So for example, Patrick Henry of Virginia, who was a delegate to the Continental Congress, declared, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." I've lived in Virginia a long time. That's a big deal to say that kind of thing. So by 1776, many Americans had made a great leap to a new idea. Maybe they could do without monarchy and aristocracy. If they could unite with one another, the common people of the colonies might form a more equal society and government, and maybe the people were enough. So not long after, I'm making another leap here to 1787, the idea of constitutional government comes from that initial leap to popular sovereignty. And Alexander Hamilton is famous for this quotation. He says, "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice rather than accident and force." Okay, that possibility of establishing a political constitution that isn't based on accident and force. What an extraordinary thing. This leap left the founding generation and every generation since with 2 key questions that the exhibition tackles. Okay, the people are sovereign, but first question, who are the people? And second question, how should they participate? The rest of the exhibition explores centuries of debate and struggle and negotiation over the answers for those questions. So from the beginning, one clear answer that everyone acknowledged was that people would participate by voting, some people. John Adams said in 1776, "It is certain in theory that the only moral foundation of government is the consent of the people. But to what extent shall we carry this principle?" Okay, that's the question for not just for his moment, but for everyone's. And here I want to bring attention to two elements of the history of Americans' debates and struggles over the right to vote. First, from the outset, the question of who should have the right to vote was left to the states of the Union. The Constitution required federal government to ensure the states had Republican governments, which certainly entailed popular elections by inhabitants in the states, but otherwise the Constitution specified little. It set no uniform requirements for voting. Because after all, the states had just recently, through the years of the Revolution and after, made their own state constitutions. They'd hammered them out through difficult compromise, and they'd made their own choices about who could vote, if you needed to own property, if you needed to be a taxpayer, if you needed to be white. All of the states had their answers. And so delegates at the Constitutional Convention kind of intelligently dismissed the possibility of them ever agreeing on that. No one could expect the South Carolinian elites to ratify a new frame of government that awarded the votes to more non-slaveholding white households. And no one could expect the people of Vermont, where there were no economic property requirements and where people were not excluded by such a thing as color or race, no one could expect them to ratify a document that would leave a bunch of them not able to vote. So it was up to the states, and the result is that story is way complicated and way varied and at times very irregular. That said, these images help us trace in general terms one narrative about a broadening suffrage. These four artifacts together create a narrative that suggests lots of groups get added in, and that's certainly true. On the left is this very rare cane or walking stick with the handle in the shape of an eagle and with the phrase "free suffrage" engraved in the little silver band near the handle. You can see the "free" and on the back is suffrage. That was the motto of many movements in many states for opening the vote to most free white men, regardless of their ownership of property. This was probably carried in a parade during the 1830s when many such parades on behalf of free suffrage took place. Next is the cover of Harper's Weekly magazine from 1867 with an image called "The First Vote," showing African-American men in the Union Army in particular casting ballots in Virginia in that year. And with the 15th Amendment a few years later, the Constitution explicitly stated that the vote could not be denied to people based on grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So here was, at least by law, the enfranchisement of massive new number of citizens. The suffrage Bluebird Day sign it's a little tin sign, which it's one of a whole group of them, which were posted around Massachusetts promoting a state referendum to give women the vote. That was in 1915. And as you know, in 1920, the 19th Amendment added to the Constitution outlawed disfranchisement based on sex. And finally, on the right is clothing from the 1970s meant to celebrate what was called the youth vote, the change in the minimum voting age from 21 to 18 in 1971, which took place in response to the student movement and the broader movement in opposition to the Vietnam War. So these things together build a narrative of steady inclusion in voting, even if it's sometimes sort of not clear why it should be so slow, why then and not other times. What it leaves out is the reality and the power of backlash against these acts of inclusion and broadening. And just as it took organized movements to create expansion of the vote, organized movements have also narrowed down the vote. I'm going to tell you my favorite one, since I'm originally from the state of New Jersey, and I rarely get to boast about it. In New Jersey, starting in 1776, women who fulfilled the fairly high property requirements set for men could vote alongside men. And all they were required was to have a certain valued 50 pounds worth of property and to have resided within the county for 12 months. So that wasn't every woman, because married women didn't own property, daughters didn't own property until they were of age. But nonetheless, thousands of women did vote in Jersey elections between 1776 and 1806. And then in 1807, the legislature removed that right. Both women and free African-American men were now denied the vote. So that's an example of the backlash that affects women in their participation, but also to varying degrees, African-Americans and other people of color in this time period. Most globally and egregiously, of course, was the backlash against the 15th Amendment, with its efforts to secure the rights and safety of African-American citizens, to assure truly representative democratic governments in the states of the former Confederacy. With the demise of radical Reconstruction and the removal of federal troops came the practical nullification of the 15th Amendment. Through acts of terror and violence and through state laws, white Southerners managed to control access to voting. This slide shows a couple of those. On the left is a poll tax announcement. Pay your tax before January 31st. This notice comes from Amarillo, Texas in the 1940s. So there's a much longer time period here where African Americans and others are not being allowed to vote than was there briefly at the time of Reconstruction, despite the amendment. On the right is a form that you filled out to become a voter in Mississippi. And it's obviously long and somewhat complicated. They could also require people to write explanations of parts of the Constitution. And of course, it was leading white people who judged people's ability to understand the Constitution and hence to vote. So that by 1962, only 13% of adult African Americans were registered to vote in Alabama and 2% in Mississippi. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes, and I'm sure you know, in 1965 passed the Voting Rights Act, probably the greatest expansion of the vote, the greatest increase that the nation's seen in a single act. Without denial, however, the nation has seen some renewed backlash. Let's go to the next slide, please. These are from the period of the Voting Rights Act. The the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, had made this one man, one vote bumper sticker. Below, the voter registration drive being pushed by the NAACP. This is from a voter registration headquarters in Warrenton, North Carolina. And so that dates from the late 1960s. The other slides date from 1970, and those are posters meant to encourage voting to people who had not been able to do so. Please register, please vote, and to people who are not native English speakers, as the Voting Rights Act increasingly covered people whose first language was not English. Since this time, I have to say, the nation has also seen a renewed backlash, and there have been movements in many states to suppress or limit voting, as everyone knows, via felon laws, voter ID laws, and other practices. And so we're still in the midst of this struggle, some trying to make the vote more accessible, more available to more Americans. For some people, that fits their notion of the nation, and others making the vote less accessible and less available, particularly to Americans with fewer resources, and also to Americans of color, expressing the conviction that's been in American history from very early, that the people who hold the vote should be a more limited group. So in sum, the right to vote is not a simple story. It's not completed or settled in our world today. I want to turn now to another aspect of popular participation. You said who should participate? Also, how should the people participate their voices to make their voices heard? And so one answer was they would rely on institutions not explicitly called for or recognized in the US Constitution itself. In particular, it became obvious very early in the 1800s and to some degree even in the 1790s that the people would participate within a framework of organized, albeit unofficial, political parties. This acceptance of party politics was not immediate. It was not intended or welcomed by everyone. Political theorists of the day objected to parties as a danger to stability and unity of government and society. They had this ideal that both the governors who were elected and the people electing, the qualified voters, would not simply promote private interests of themselves or their family or their class or their region, but would support the good of the whole. And that idealistic way of thinking made it hard to accept people dividing themselves up into groups and competing with one another. They called the use of public power to line one's own pockets corruption. So if you enriched your friends and connections, or even beyond that, if you thought and acted solely for the good of your own neighborhood or interests, that wasn't really the idea that the founding generation had in mind. This is a cartoon from the 1790s, and it is called A Peep into the Anti-Federal Club. It depicts an early political faction, not maybe a party in the sense that there's not a lot of they haven't organized a lot of voters, although to some degree. And these are real figures that people of the day would have recognized. That's Jefferson standing up, and down under his arm, Tom Paine. And over on the left, looking through a telescope, is David Rittenhouse of Pennsylvania. There's an African-American who is a type, and indeed a stereotype, called Mungo. And sitting on towards the bottom on the left is the devil. So this is not a positive portrayal of political parties. It's an idea that they are always conspiring, that they are, all of them, talking radical ideas all the time. That's certainly the message of this. And it expresses that sense that it's not quite legitimate to join together in these parties. Although it should be said that the cartoon was made to please the other faction, the Federalists or Hamiltonians. And over time, it turned out that political parties would turn out to be essential to the way that American democracy worked. The Republic has not functioned from the early 1800s to today, without political parties. And the next slide will show you a representation of that. This is great if you want to memorize everything. It's called The Diagram of the Rise and Fall of American Political Parties from 1789 to 1880, inclusive. And it's from a book published in 1880 as a handy and attractive reference. So it starts early on with the Constitution and carries through all the changes in parties since on the national level since the founding. It also lists some of the issues and shows the splintering of parties, the leaders of some parties. And so you could get a pretty good sense if you were studying political history of what had happened. These parties provided a way for people to develop their ideas, to meet and connect with others like-minded, to build majorities that might make their needs and their commitments felt in the government. They shared some principles and they compromised over others. They agreed to support one another's views for the sake of achieving a majority status. They rallied around shared party platforms and joint candidates. So as it happened, to create an effective party, people found they had to ally themselves with others with whom they otherwise might have little in common to achieve the status where they could enact specific policies and shape the direction of the nation. So this doubtful and dangerous and clearly corruptible thing, the political party system, came to seem essential to rule by a sovereign people. Besides developing institutions unanticipated by the Constitution, such as party conventions and campaigns, the whole system of American democracy came to rely upon a set of expectations. So these are informal rules, not written down. First, it was important that everyone recognize that it was legitimate to criticize the government. And in fact, if you criticize the party in power, it was necessary that such criticism be protected. That was, of course, written basically in the First Amendment to the Constitution. There was another rule specifically for campaigns and elections, and that was that candidates and their parties would treat their opponents as legitimate opposition, that is, not enemies, not unentitled to run. You're entitled to run. And it would be legitimate to disagree. Even to throw your hat in the ring, people had to know that the framework was one that I call normal politics. That's where everyone accepts you're entitled to have your ideas, you're entitled to express them, you're entitled to campaign. And you are also expected to follow certain standards of fairness and truth. Never perfectly carried out, I am certain, but that idea needs to be in place in order for this system to represent the popular will, and in fact, even for people to participate. You're not going to run for office if it means the other team might not just dig up some dirt on you, but kidnap your children or something. I mean, these kinds of violent overthrows or the dismissal of opposition as illegitimate was something that recognizes the destruction of this system. And a popular metaphor that expresses that premise is when Americans talk about our politics as a horse race, an election as a horse race, which they started doing in the early 1800s and of course still do in one degree or another. Now, in the normal times of normal politics, when campaigns have more or less largely abided by the rules, by the expectations, they have generated material articles that museums can show, and we have a bunch of those. They show humor and creativity and even lighthearted gimmicks. On your left is a wooden log cabin, which was placed on a pole, and it was carried in a parade in 1840 to support William Henry Harrison, who was born in a log cabin and drank hard cider. You can see the cider barrel at the side of that. And he was popular because he was an ordinary guy, at least in his background, or could pretend to be. To the right is a tintype from 1860. This young man is a member of the Wide Awakes, a club that supported the Republican nominee Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And you can see he's wearing an oilcloth cape and hat, and he's holding a stick with a torch on it. And so he was involved in torchlight parades. Next slide, please. This could become pretty unserious in some ways. Here's a coffee cup. The idea was you drink your coffee at home and watch Kennedy on TV during the election. And you could also use a pot holder and open your oven door with Ike. These are artifacts that our museum has just lots and lots of, generated by the campaign system that has supported our democracy. But let's go to the next, because I do want to say that it isn't always normal politics. And here's an image of the Wide Awakes in their torchlight parade in New York City in 1860. This was something where young men tended to participate, often too young to vote. It might be they went out and created this spectacle, and it testified to the power of their party. But even at the time, Southern sympathizers thought this was a little aggressive because it was not really a time of normal politics. It's a time of abnormal politics. And this grand procession of the wide awakes in Harper's Weekly shows you that you could understand seeing this as possibly crossing the line, or at least being at the line between the kind of horse race, we're all sportsmen here together and we're following the rules, and a sense of power, being willing to break rules. So as critics have pointed out, normal politics can be easily acknowledged in the opposition at being legitimate precisely when the most divisive issues in the society are not at stake. If you're not voting about the future of slavery, but you're voting about many other issues, then you can have a much clearer sense of that the parties are both legitimate or all legitimate. So there's a limit to normal politics in the sense that they thrived by when there's a shared willingness to postpone or push to the margin some issues that are simply too divisive. Whether American democracy can now effectively mediate or decide the most crucial issues so as to stay together, to me, that still remains uncertain. Let's look at another practice or form, which another part of the exhibition does. This is another answer to the question, how should people participate? Well, they should participate by petitioning. Here in this slide is a written petition. This was a right that was recognized in early modern England. People of England could always petition the ruler who was obligated to listen to or receive in writing the grievances of the people when presented humbly and properly. And that practice continued in all the states of the United States. But this one is a memorial from the ladies of Steubenville, Ohio, protesting the proposed Indian Removal Act of 1830, which would forcibly relocate Native American tribes from their ancestral lands. So this is February 15th, 1830, and you see the ladies' names. There's also, so the next slide shows another form of petitioning, which is lobbying. And lobbying is a form that it's easy to be critical of. It certainly is partial. Not everyone so easily gets access to congresspeople and senators. It is certainly related to money, but it's very much also a part of the American system to bring information and desires of the people, whether they be individuals or special interest groups, to the Congress. In this game, which I have to admit, never having played, it was put out by Milton Bradley in 1949. And what happens, the way you play it is if you're a player, you become either a senator or a representative, and you go around this board and you try to navigate your bill through Congress. You get help from some and hindrance from other special interest groups. I maybe should go study how many Milton Bradley sold, because it'd be interesting to know if it was popular outside the area of Washington, D.C., or maybe state government capitals also. Finally, there's another form of petitioning, which is when you petition with your feet. And what matters here is that people have protested in public places to bring to the attention of rulers and governors that they are indeed servants of the people. They are obligated to listen. And in the last analysis, the government are the people, not the reverse. So here we see some of the many different placards. Some were printed up by organizations forming coalitions around issues. Some are handwritten. We have a really large collection going back to certainly the 1950s and 60s. And here, these three suggest three different points of view. First is not 4 more years, not 1 more day, U.S. Out Now, which is talking about getting the U.S. out of Vietnam. And it's from a protest march that took place in Washington, D.C. in 1970. The Stop Abortion Now sign was carried at an anti-abortion protest in Washington in 1990 to mark the 17th anniversary of the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision. 75,000 protesters marched from the White House to the Supreme Court steps, and some of them carried this sign. And finally, if the farmer can't survive, America dies. And this was carried in a farmers' strike in Washington, D.C. in 1978, when farmers were calling for 100% parity, which meant they wanted a connection between the price that they were allowed to charge for farm goods with how much it costs them to have inputs to the farm. So these are all tokens of the First Amendment right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Finally, there's a section of this exhibition that goes to the question of what sort of people does such a system need? And it comes on many different aspects of American life. Certainly it's a question about immigration. And this image is entitled The Hyphenated American. It appeared in the magazine Puck in August of 1899. And what you see are people vote in the line voting, and they're dressed half Irish and half, I guess, American, half German and half American, and other recognizable costumes to people at the time. There's Uncle Sam sitting on the ballot box, and he's saying, why should I let these freaks cast whole votes when they're only half American? So this image specifically relates to voting, but it is one of many images that suggests, to one degree or another, excluding immigrants. And it was published at a time when immigration from China and other parts of Asia was strictly limited. And it was just a few decades before the laws passed in the 1920s, when there were strict quotas passed, put on the limit of immigration of what were considered the wrong sorts of Europeans from Central and Southern Europe. So there were then, and there have been at many times, groups that some Americans see as unworthy or incapable of inclusion in American society and participation in the democracy. The nation has also debated if and how such immigrants should be Americanized. We wondered, did Americans need to share a single language? That's been debated at different points, at different times, and about different languages. Should they agree on a shared understanding of their national history? Should we commemorate the same heroes and events on national holidays that everyone would all observe, either alike or maybe in their own regional or ethnic or particular way? Do they need a shared system or a common system of education so as to make sure that all Americans see themselves as part of an overarching and singular American people? These questions have resounded through our history. Nor have Americans always agreed on either the obligations or the rights of citizenship. For example, the obligation to serve in the military has at times been present, at other times not. And we don't necessarily even share the same understanding of the freedoms we should enjoy. And this penultimate slide is an image from the exhibition, comes from World War II. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt delivered a message to Congress in January of 1941, where he articulated national aims in defense of democracies around the world. He said, "We look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms." And the artist Norman Rockwell dramatized these aims in a series of paintings that appeared as covers of the Saturday Evening Post and as posters produced by the Office of War Information for its war bond campaign in 1943. And you can see 2 of them where the first 2 where they say save freedom of speech and save freedom of religion or worship. These are things understood to be in the Bill of Rights, and other things, it says ours to fight for, freedom from want, ours to fight for, freedom from fear. These are a view of the freedoms Americans should have that were very powerful in a time when America was in a deep depression and there was fear of war. And so these are particular ideas about the kinds of protections citizens of the nation should receive. But it wasn't settled then, and of course it isn't settled now. So finally, I'm going to end with just one more image, and this is also an 18th century image, my favorite time period. It's called Congressional Pugilist. It's the Congress meeting in Philadelphia in 1798, and it's a crude portrayal of a fight on the floor of Congress between Vermont Representative Matthew Lyon and Roger Griswold of Connecticut. There was argument, and it turned out to be an attack. It turns out that these men end up wrestling on the floor of the House. And it's funny, this image comes from the Library of Congress, and they have a little thing they say about it. It said it took some time to accept the idea that opposition can strengthen a democratic society. And it's an interesting thing to read now, because I think we would all acknowledge we're struggling with issues. We're not wrestling on the floor of Congress, I hope, yet, but we're all wrestling in some sense, I think, with many of these issues that have been there from the beginning. Who are the people? How should they participate? And do we still want to make that leap of faith to believing in and participating in and supporting this system of American democracy? So I'll end there and maybe open it up.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And we do have a few questions, but I want to start with one. Now, the permanent exhibit in Washington opened, I think, in June of 2017. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you were developing and opening that exhibit today or in 5 years, would it have changed? Has the way you thought about American democracy and the leaping that we need to do, has that changed?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, at the time we opened, which was however many, 6 months or some months after the presidential election that elected Donald Trump, we were told by many people, oh, how did you get to be so timely? How did you do an exhibit on such a topical subject? And of course, it was topical before that. We saw these changes happening. I do think that, however, that I can speak for myself, I was surprised by the time the exhibit opened. I had not realized how deep the divisions among Americans were about the issues of legitimate opposition and the issues of having organized opposition be okay, and Americans' commitment to these practices that have been basic to democracy through history. So I would say everything was more tense and difficult, and it was revealed we maybe could have made more clear or emphasized further, less the normal politics when there's lots of fun stuff that the campaigns use, and more sort of the tough times when there are really important issues being settled by campaigns or through other means. I do want to say our campaign section of the exhibit includes a whole lot of screens with TV, so it's not just cute little gadgets or buttons you might have from the campaign, but the fact of television, advertising, and other expensive forms of campaigning which bring in the issue of money. And I think those themes are all present in our exhibit, but I suspect we would have made them stronger, clearer, if we were speaking to you today.
Okay, well, thank you. And as you know, the hosting institution was invited or expected to include their state history, which we did and highlighted different things. And in our upcoming exhibit, we will be expanding. And when I said we're working on it, it wasn't just we're working on it. that's going to be the title, because it
Right.
speaks to what you're talking about, is that it's not a finished thing. It's a process. The debates continue, and sometimes looking at those hard times, maybe in the past, and can help us understand the future. So I do have some questions. So first one from Tricia was, what kind of collecting are you doing around the current presidential campaign?
Oh, well, I personally, being the 18th century person, am not involved, but I never get to do this. Usually we send people to the conventions, and before that, we already have had people collect from different states that have had a caucus, the Iowa caucus, and various state primaries. And we will certainly collect from the conventions, although it may be in some different form. So we have campaign material that goes back. We have a button that has George, not a picture, not a metal button, an actual button. Well, actually it is metal, a brass button that you'd put on a shirt, you'd sew on a shirt to commemorate George Washington's inauguration. He didn't have a campaign, right? So it's not a campaign piece, but very soon after that, there were buttons. And so we are collecting, especially the curators who specialize in the history of presidential politics and voting and campaigns, are collecting all kinds of ephemera created by the campaigns to get people to the polls, sometimes to discourage people from going to the polls, to recommend your candidate and why he or she is better than the other candidate. It's tricky because we now also have to pay attention to digital collecting, since a lot of campaigning goes on online, as a lot of campaigning in the past has gone on television. So we're also looking into doing that.
Great. And we were talking earlier about collecting protest and the other aspects of not just campaigning, but that we're living through right now. Barbara has asked to please talk about today's voter rights and the notion of voting by mail. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm not an expert on voting by mail, but I think it is quite clear that we still are divided, and there are still some tremendous problems with access to the vote. We look at what happened in Georgia yesterday, and there were tremendous long lines. And there were tremendous long lines waiting to vote, and some people who were unable to vote because the machines weren't working, or there weren't enough machines, or whatever various reasons. And whether that was an explicit decision made to keep the vote down in some parts of the state, which certainly some people believe, or whether it was not, I guess the Secretary of State in Georgia knows, I don't know. But I think you can see very clearly that the question of having the vote be secure and making it possible for you to vote, it's things like not having a holiday on election day means a lot of working people have a hard time juggling their day so as to get to vote. And those are choices that we make. And there are certainly Americans who would like voting to be easier, and there's certainly Americans who would like it to be more difficult. And those both points of view have a long history.
Okay, great. Next question from Brett. North Carolina has some of the most gerrymandered districts in the country. What is the history of gerrymandering in this country? I will say that we devoted some special attention to gerrymandering. In fact, we now have a virtual reality game, Gerrymander Madness, the anti-democracy game, which will be available online for free through Steam in the next few weeks. But anyway, and in our upcoming exhibit, we're definitely going to be focusing on gerrymandering, but the very first, where the name come from, of course, goes back. So maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Sure. No, that sounds like a great game. And I'm not sure, I don't know which state excels the most at different moments as it changes. Gerrymandering is named for Elbridge Gerry, in Massachusetts Politico, who represented a district within the state that was supposedly in the shape of a dragon or a monster. It was kind of all over. And so even early in the 1800s, there were images published to decry what they called the gerrymander. The mander part is from the word salamander, because they said it looked like a salamander going off all directions. And it's that's certainly part of what parties try to do. And it's one of those borderline things that in theory, I think everyone agrees that congressional districts should be formed to be fair, and so that the results of the election actually represent the voices of the people. But in particular cases, it's very easy to wish that your side win, and that if it's close at all, one way of bringing that about is by gerrymandering the electoral districts. And there's a whole lot, of course, methods of voter suppression, which occur throughout history. Sometimes there's a crackdown and people clean it up, or there's a movement that demands that things be more visible, more accountable, more checkable by a third party, that there should be a nonpartisan way to vote, and to divide up into congressional districts. But as far as I know, no one's exactly solved it.
Okay. All right, Carolyn is asking, what role did Native Americans play in the history of voting?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not going to get absolutely everything straight. And Native Americans, the ones who live within the early republic, that is within what the United States saw as its bounds after 1787, there were Native American people, and some of them might vote. Some of the men who fulfilled the property requirements might vote. But that was really quite limited, and they were as likely to be denied the vote as to receive it. And for that matter, these are people who saw themselves as members of other nations, not necessarily of the United States. So there has been a long history in which Native peoples have both sought to keep control and sovereignty over their own tribal governments, which have authority in their own sovereign areas, and also to participate. And you do, I believe it's the 1924, the Dawes Act, which makes Native Americans citizens of the United States. And they too have faced many of the problems of people of color in general. So nowadays, I think there's quite active, and you can look at the way that the American Indian movement included at different points political participation in the US government or in voting as part of the agenda. It's not always the agenda, it's not always the thing wanted, but you know, it's also a group that is very much part of the American people.
Okay, and someone asked, how much longer will the American Democracy exhibit remain in Greensboro? So the Smithsonian's traveling exhibit is being packed up almost as we speak. We've been working on it this week. It's heading out to Denver. So unfortunately, in the next couple of weeks, it will be out of Greensboro. The good news is there's a lot of information online. There's a book that was published about this exhibit. The permanent exhibit is in Washington, so as soon as the Smithsonian's back open again, yep, you can see that. And then again, the Greensboro History Museum will be opening an exhibit called North Carolina Democracy. We're working on it in the fall. And we hope to continue to bring more projects and programs. Another thing I can't forget to mention is that on our YouTube channel, we've been doing a series, our Curator of exhibits, called Deeper Inside Project Democracy. And so we have, I think, about 6 videos now that dive a little bit deeper into the exhibit, the Smithsonian exhibit, and particularly the North Carolina elements that we added. So that'll be another opportunity for you to get a feeling of what this exhibit was like. So one other question. Gail asked, are the flags for candidates so prominent now a new phenomenon?
The
Flags.
flags
So,
with the candidates on them?
so
I'm not sure. They're as early as the election of 1800, people did create banners, which they sometimes would carry in a parade or hang on a building. So actually there have been banners and signs like that from very early on. We have one that has Thomas Jefferson shown, although it's not during the campaign, it's after. It says Thomas Jefferson, President, John Adams is no more. So that was one point of view. And that is extraordinary that it survived because it's a fabric piece. But I don't know too much about flags used. Certainly the American flag is carried and used in all kinds of campaigns, but campaign flags that say the name of the candidate. Yeah, there's certainly some through the 20th century, those kind of triangular pennants that some might have college name on them, also might have a candidate's name on them. So they do exist.
okay. And a lot of people thanking you for a wonderful presentation. And I thought for our final question, right now we are living through what seems to be unprecedented, extraordinary times, dealing with both a pandemic and this reckoning of racial inequality and social injustice. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that or could leave us with some thoughts of hope about the way our democracy works, that we're going to work through it.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that we've had a lot of problems getting along in the past, and none of history will tell us what's going to happen next. I mean, you can't, this is a new time. We can't say, well, it happened this way before, it'll definitely happen that way now. No, it really depends on what people choose. One thing about this democracy is it depends on participation, and it really depends on people being willing to make a difference. I do think we are facing, among other issues, the issue that was present at the time of the Constitution, which is, does the people include all the people? Does the people include people of color? Does it include people who are poor? How can that system survive if not? How can the system be worked so as to make possible a truly representative government much more of the time? You know, you asked me if I'd do something different now in the exhibit. I think we would probably have talked more in the exhibit about race than we do. In fact, it's very present in every section because it is always a major issue. Whether you're petitioning, whether you're voting, whether you're creating a revolution, always is the question. And I think the centrality of those issues to American history is undeniable. I always feel, as an 18th century scholar, when I'm sitting there and reading Jefferson or some non-famous ordinary man or woman, particularly around issues of slavery and race, I always feel personally, I wish you guys could have done just a little bit better. I understand why the world was hard. I understand how much you faced when you wanted to improve things. But we all know the tragedy that has followed and the suffering and that's followed from each generation's, the limits to each generation's willingness, certainly among leading and certainly among white Americans, to open and to listen and to welcome the participation of immigrants, of formerly enslaved peoples and their descendants, the ability to really approximate that world where all men are created equal. I wish people had gone a little farther, and I try to bear that in mind. It seems to me it would be great if our generation was very careful to defend democracy at this time and push the boundaries and make changes, as well as keep things that are already established, so as to leave our children and their children a more perfect union, I think is the phrase.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara. And in closing, I just want to say that there's more history coming from the History Museum. Particularly excited about next Friday, which is June 19th, also called Juneteenth, an African-American celebration. And in Greensboro, there was a proclamation, and all our city departments are working together, including the library department and Parks and Rec and Cultural Affairs. And the museum has programs all through the day. We have at least 4 different live webinars from local historians, some fun things with Dame's Chicken and Waffles. And we don't know what time yet, but Rhiannon Giddens, who is working on an opera on the Wilmington coup, is going to do something for us that day as well. So check back with us about that. A lot to do with democracy, Emancipation Proclamation, and more to come. And Barbara, thank you again so much for spending some time with us. And thank you all in the audience. And we hope to see you again. And again, for any of you who would like to review this again or tell a friend about it, it has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So
thank you so much.
Thank you again.